I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome back to my Amityville Horror Book-a-thon, as no one is calling it. Last video we looked at John G. Jones's The Amityville Horror Part 2, the continuing trials and tribulations of the Lutz family after they left the famous Amityville house at 112 Ocean Avenue, and the story continues and concludes in Amityville Horror 3, Amityville Horror The Final Chapter as it's also known. Now, if you saw the previous video, yesterday's video, you'll remember that I said that Amityville Horror Part 2 just kind of stops. It kind of fumbles around and says, oh, here's a denouement, there's a random exorcism, and yeah, that's the end of our story. And it really felt very much like, cripes, we have to cut this short so that we can have a third book to tell the rest of the tale. So this is Part 2 and 3 really act as one whole story. Is it a story worth telling? I'm not so sure. Because Part 3 is an ending, and because John G. Jones is clearly moving even further away from trying to present what happened to the Lutz family as fact, I can tell you it's more fun. In his foreword, again, Jones gives himself a little bit of a get out of jail free card with regard to the actual facts and history of the story he's trying to tell. Reverend Timothy Johnston once told Kathy and George Lutz that reality is what you perceive. If it is real to you, then it is real. In Amityville 3, as in the previous volume, I have attempted to convey the perception, the feelings, as well as the facts. In that effort, and with George and Kathy's permission, you will find the story that follows presented in a narrative, novelised style. It's a style, and I said it in yesterday's video, that I prefer to Jay Anson's more fact-based seeming reportage style, and it gives Jones a sort of liminal space between pure flights of the imagination and at least trying to present facts, a liminal space within which to weave this novelised account of what it felt like to be George and Kathy Lutz so many years later. What we're introduced to straight off the bat in Part 3 is this notion that for years clairvoyants, mind readers, psychics all around the world have predicted that the horror for the Lutz family would last 7 years. When is that ever mentioned in any of the Reader, it's not mentioned previously. It's a nice new little device for this final part of a trilogy to say, after 7 years, as was predicted, the horror will come to an end, but not before the entity from the house makes one last attempt to get them. So we're building towards a final showdown. Also, in order to give himself more room to maneuver, we're introduced to sort of ancillary characters around the orbit of the Lutz family, so that we can have stuff happen to them. Not least the author himself, John G. Jones. Yes, Jones writes about himself in the third person in his own book. Yes, it continues to be weird, and yes, he has an exorcism because he himself is possessed. We also have the poor put upon babysitter for the Lutz family after they moved out, Terry, who features more heavily in this book, because with my cynic's hat on, because the records will show that nothing like this happened to the Lutz family, and I'm talking about physical attacks, hospitalization and the like. So these horrible, awful things have to happen to this secondary character. Poor Terry, and even Terry's mother, get attacked and hospitalized, brutalized in horrible ways. And you just can't help but feel that she's a narrative device just to be a sacrificial lamb for the story, so that the evil can seem evil. Also, in the build-up to this final showdown, the entity which in Jones's books becomes more and more closely aligned to this Jodie character that the young daughter associated with, which is sometimes seen as a demonic pig, sometimes tells her that he's an angel. This Jodie entity is now in a last desperate effort to get the Lutzes manifesting physically more and more, entering the real world and actually able to do them physical harm, so that they can have the family versus Jodie, a final, once and for all, physical showdown where they sort of use the positive vibes and the power of light, and it even uses a weapon the collected letters of believers and supporters from around the world from over the years as a weapon against this evil force. It all gets a little hokey, but if you're like me and you think that trying to pass off this story as real in any way is a little hokey anyway, you can kind of strap yourself into the ghost train and go along for the ride. It's significantly shorter than part 2, and it has an actual ending in mind, so it fairly zips along. Stuff happens rather than an awful lot of wheels spinning. We don't go on as many book tours with the Lutzes in this film. We do go to Japan with them and Australia, I think, in this one. It bleeds into part 2 a lot. I think in part 2 we went on an Amsterdam book tour. Here, Australia and Japan, perhaps. Yeah, it's all good, silly fun. There's a little bit more shade thrown on the original author, Jay Anson, in this, which I find a little bit weird. And there's also some shade thrown on the second film, Amityville 2, The Possession, which within the timeline of this story comes out just towards the end of the story. And it's a little chance for the Lutzes, perhaps through John Jones, to settle a few scores. They take a couple of snipes at Amityville 2, The Possession. They say, it's not even about us. It's not even really about the DeFeos. No, it's not. And it's all the better for it as a film. It's just a sleazy horror exploitation haunted house movie that I happen to love. And it happens to be based on Murder in Amityville by Hans Holzer. So seeing as Amityville 2, The Possession is mentioned at the end of Amityville 3, I think the next book we should move on to is Hans Holzer's Murder in Amityville.